Good afternoon, and welcome to today's event on Shaping U.S.-Caribbean Ties. I'm Jason Barzak, Vice President and Senior Director of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center here at the Atlantic Council. I'd like to begin by thanking Bahamas Foreign Minister Fred Mitchell for joining us today. Minister, great to have you. This is a rescheduled event from the last snowstorm, and so appropriately we have 2 to 4 inches of snow forecast for tonight. Excellent as well to have St. Lucia's Foreign Minister, Alva Baptiste, joining us here in the in-studio audience. Foreign Minister, great to have you here as well. I'm also very pleased to welcome a great friend, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Caribbean Affairs and Haiti, Barbara Feinstein, who will be joining the conversation today, already seated at the news desk after Minister Mitchell's keynote remarks. Das Feinstein is not only a great friend of the organization, but really prioritizes the Caribbean every single day of her job. We see that here, so great to have you here. I'd also like to welcome the many friends of the Center who are joining us in person today, but especially the many ambassadors, including Ambassador Chet Niemeyer and Ambassador Wendell Jones, who are important partners in this event, but in the many other work that we have done leading up to this event and beyond, and welcome to the many other ambassadors in this conversation today too. Our conversation comes at a key moment for U.S.-Caribbean relations. Over the past few years, Caribbean countries and the United States have worked closely to address shared challenges, from climate change to the energy transition to security cooperation. Challenges remain, but progress has been made. Today, we'll discuss how the United States and the Caribbean can build on this progress and work together to address challenges, including the crisis in Haiti. A critical component of strengthened U.S.-Caribbean cooperation is tied to the U.S.-Caribbean Partnership to Address the Climate Crisis 2030, which is the flagship U.S. policy for the region. PAC 2030 benefits from significant Caribbean insights and inputs and has been a joint effort to enhance climate and energy resilience while building local capacity at the national and at the regional levels. The importance of this partnership, which was launched at the Summit of the Americas, is why the Atlantic Council released the first ever publication on PAC 2030 in 2022, shortly after the summit, and then formed a working group to support its implementation last year. This year, we'll take it a step further as we continue to build off last year's PAC 2030 Climate Resilient Clean Energy Summit that the Atlantic Council organized on the sidelines of Vice President Harris's first trip to the Caribbean and the Bahamas, actually around the Prime Minister's birthday, as we were discussing earlier. I'm excited to announce that in partnership with the U.S. State Department, we will host and organize the PAC 2030 Road to Implementation Summit next month in the Dominican Republic on the sidelines of the Energy and Climate Partnership for the Americas ministerial meetings. The summit will bring together a multi-stakeholder group to identify pathways to implementing PAC 2030 across climate resilience, the energy transition, food security, and local capacity building. We're very excited to work with the State Department and other partners at this critical moment for PAC 2030 and for the Caribbean. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce the Honorable Fred Mitchell, Foreign Minister of the Bahamas, for keynote remarks before he joins a fireside conversation with Das Feinstein. Minister, again, thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Mitchell has served as Foreign Minister previously from 2002 to 2007, and during that time was instrumental in integrating Haiti into CARICOM. He also led the establishment of Bahamas' diplomatic mission in Cuba and China, expanding his country's global reach. He has wide-ranging experience in the global community, and we are very excited to have him here with us today. Minister, I'd like to welcome you to the podium, please, for brief keynote remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So, thank you very much, Jason and Ms. Feinstein. Good to see you. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my colleagues who joined me from the Bahamas and from St. Lucia, I want to thank you for this invitation, and I bring greetings and best wishes for Prime Minister Philip Davis, who appreciated the invitation to speak here last year. Now, I've been Foreign Minister, as you heard, for 3 occasions, if you count this stint. The first was our first Foreign Minister, then known as the Minister of External Affairs, was Lyndon Pinley, then Prime Minister. In 1973, he spoke to the United Nations to lay out the path of the country in its foreign relations, which seemed twofold. He said that we should be associates of all and enemies of none, and to rely on multilateralism as the linchpin of our international relations. When the late Arthur Hanna was Governor General of the Bahamas, he was accepting the credentials of the ambassador to the Bahamas for Korea, South Korea, and he said that the Bahamas and South Korea had something in common. He said, "We're both nestled next to giants, and we're only as independent as the giants allow." That sets the scene and the reality check for us, a small nation, and the context within which this small nation manages its international affairs. While the Bahamas does not see itself as a part of a geopolitical contest between the U.S. and China, we are as close as 50 miles away from the U.S. land border, and our citizens come to the United States for education, shopping, vacations, health care, you name it, or simply because they feel like getting away for the day. The late Bahamian Senator Cleveland Eneas, who was himself educated at Tuskegee and Macquarie and married an American woman, told me that this line, that the definition of a Bahamian is in part someone who believes they have an inalienable right to shop in Miami. He told me another version of the story, and that is the then Consul General in the pre-independence era of the Bahamas, Turner B. Shelton, was stopped by a Bahamian on the streets of Nassau and was asked by the man why his visa application had been denied. And he told the United States, he told him that the United States did not allow him to give him the visa. And the man told the Consul General, "But I don't want to go to the United States, I want to go to Miami." The connections are also family ties, from James Weldon Johnson to Sidney Poitier to W.E.B. Du Bois to Congresswoman Frederica Wilson, Fred Papal, and then Flip Wilson and Lawrence Fishburne, the latter of whom are U.S. citizens who married Bahamian women. Now, the United States is a huge country, stating the obvious, 350 million people, and we are a country of 400,000. And I've been arguing for visa-free access to the United States for Bahamians, and I've argued that if the 400,000 of us moved to the U.S. today, it would not make one bit of negative difference to the economy and cultural well-being of your country. Again, for context, I went back to my alma mater, Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio, the town which is famous as the home of Dave Chappelle. I went to visit the Baptist church there, and they announced that Sunday morning that an out-of-town visitor was in church, and they asked me to stand. So after church, the lady walked up to me and asked me to confirm that I was a stranger from out of town, and I confirmed it. Then she said, "Are you from Springfield?" Springfield is a town 9 miles down the road. I suppose my being from Nassau was just beyond the imagination. My point, though, is it reinforced how vast the U.S. is and how far we in Nassau are from the reality of those who live in, for example, Ohio or Illinois, and the idea of our country and the reality of their lives. So when we argue from an international perspective and the context, it is easy for it to fall on deaf ears in your legislature. So in many senses, the maintenance of the relationship is probably more important to us than to you. We accept 9 million and counting tourists every year, mainly Americans. That drives our economy. We spend $1.5 billion US dollars in South Florida in a year, mainly on food and goods. That did not stop, though, a local politician there from saying that if we fired rockets at South Florida, if he became president, he would flatten the Bahamas. Our citizens wondered, where on earth did that come from? And how could someone, a public government official no less, make such an obtuse and insensitive statement? Yet, what we spend is a drop in the bucket to you, an economy of 123 trillion GDP, as opposed to us with a mere 9 billion or so. But we have a right to exist, and our culture also. So that's our central argument today, put before this august body, no less recently than our Prime Minister, Philip Davis, who spoke on the issue of climate change. We have a right to exist, and notwithstanding size, there is an interdependence which exists and a responsibility to recognize that interdependence and appreciate it. The Bahamas still subscribes to the construct of the Pax Americana, that world order that was brought into being post the Second World War that created the United Nations and other multilateral agencies that represent the countries, peoples, and regions of the world. So we're in the UN, CARICOM, OAS, and other international bodies as our best defense for survival. What troubles us now is that while your nation has its choices, there seems to be a breaking down of that norm into a retreat toward isolationism and each man for him or herself that threatens that world order. The Prime Minister addressed that in his first climate change summit when stating the obvious, that climate change is existential for us, and he asked whether, after withdrawing from the commitments of the climate change agreement and then coming back, whether the United States and the climate change issues would be there for the long haul, or whether political change would scuttle the treaty again. The Bahamas has no choice but to continue to be engaged as an advocate for global climate action, and we continue to do so at the COP and here in D.C. with our chairmanship of the Inter-American Sustainable Development Committee, but there are worrying signs of dissembling or worse, backsliding on commitments among key global partners, including some factions here in the U.S. Now, I use climate change as an example, but this is a key concern across a range of issues, for example, crime fighting, the export of guns from America, and Haiti. It was clear after the COVID crisis that there is no substitute for U.S. leadership in these matters. We soldier on without the U.S. and in their absence, but the U.S. is needed, and that is the message we bring here today. The U.S.-Caribbean Partnership to Address the Climate Crisis 2030, the PAC 2030, is a promising mechanism for channeling U.S.-Caribbean cooperation, but we need to scale up the ambition of our collaboration in order to meet the moment. In this regard, that's the story which is repeated throughout the CARICOM Caribbean states. It's a moral message, it's a political message, it's an economic message. The Bahamas, to quote Margaret Thatcher, is not for turning. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mitchell, for those excellent keynote remarks and for really setting the stage for this conversation. I want to welcome you here to the table, and Das Feinstein, again, wonderful to have you join us. We have some time now to speak about a couple key issues. One is the CARICOM Heads of Government meeting coming up shortly. Minister, you mentioned climate change and the existential threat that poses to the Bahamas. And we'll talk about climate concerns, climate financing, Haiti, and the road ahead. And I promise we'll do that all by 5 o'clock Eastern, because I do recognize it is a long holiday weekend here in the United States. Mr. Mitchell, maybe beginning with the CARICOM Heads of Government meeting, which will be in Guyana later this month. What would be some of the types of discussions, the outcomes that you are hoping to see achieved in that very important meeting?
Well, you know, national security is a huge issue right now. The headlines have been captured around the world about the issue of crime in the Bahamas in particular. All of our societies have been concerned about national security. Trinidad convened a meeting of all heads to discuss how we can tackle this issue and what's happening on crime, particularly the homicide rates, and dealing in particular with the U.S. and the question of the export of guns. So I would expect at this meeting that be top of it is discussions again. And I want to say, in general, the Caribbean's a safe destination. Certainly the Bahamas is. I speak for us. But, you know, a couple of days ago, there was this shooting in the United States where two young men, I assume they were young men, just had a dispute and just decided in the middle of a crowd to fire guns at one another. And this is what is happening throughout our populations. There's some dysfunctions with the young male population, which we don't quite understand or how to capture, and we have to spend a lot of resources trying to resolve that issue. So there's that front. And secondly, I expect climate change to be front and center because it is existential for all Caribbean countries, all CARICOM countries. And so resources will have to be spent to try and ramp up what we do. And particularly as it relates also to energy security. How do we power our societies while at the same time fighting the issue of climate change?
You mentioned the tragic shooting, and thank you for acknowledging that. Before I go to Das Feinstein, just a quick follow-up question. What do you hope could be achieved on crime, gun trafficking, climate change, as part of those CARICOM Head of Government meetings later this month?
I'm hoping that quite apart from the agreements which we strengthened between ourselves and the United States, the alcohol, tobacco, firearms unit, There is a commitment by all leaders for investment in seeking to resolve this problem of dysfunction among young males in our societies across the board. Yeah. I think if we can do that in the long term, that's ultimately the solution to this issue.
Fantastic. And again, Das Feinstein, welcome. The U.S. delegation also will be at the CARICOM meetings. What is the U.S. hoping to also get out of those meetings? And also maybe how is the U.S. looking to build on the progress made over the course of the last year in strengthening U.S.-Caribbean ties?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. And again, thank you very much to the Atlantic Council for hosting this session and for continuing to shine a spotlight on the Caribbean, which we believe is so important. It's obviously a pleasure to be with Foreign Minister Mitchell, who we joke brings the snow when he comes. So we will know the next time he has a visit scheduled what to expect.
I'll check the weather report. I'll know when he's coming. Right.
Also a pleasure to have the Foreign Minister of St. Lucia with us and so many ambassadors and friends in the audience. In terms of our expectations for the upcoming Heads of Government meeting, I think these meetings for us present an opportunity to both listen, to share progress, and hold ourselves accountable against the many commitments that we have made, especially in the wake of the Summit of the Americas, where we launched PAC 2030, the high-level action committees, and we intend to zero in on precisely the issues that Minister Mitchell mentioned, including citizen security, addressing illegal weapons trafficking, looking at issues around climate change, energy security, access to finance, food security. So we hope to have a structured discussion with colleagues from the Caribbean around those issues about what we can do to be helpful and advance progress on those issues. And of course, also to discuss Haiti, which is a vital issue of concern for all of us.
And we'll come back to Haiti later in the discussion. To build on your comments, though, what do you hope would be achieved as part of those discussions on these issues in which the U.S. delegation, Mr. Mitchell mentioned, very much in sync on the issues to be addressed? What do you hope to get out of it?
So I think, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, the way that we have crafted PAC 2030 is perhaps distinct from many other development initiatives in the sense that it is informed very much by goals and priorities set by our Caribbean partners. And working in a mutual sense to establish benchmarks and targets and, again, hold ourselves accountable. So I think that it is an opportunity to check in on where we are and where there are reforms that need to be made in the Caribbean, also to advance progress, to talk about some of those issues as well, and continue to advance progress.
Mm-hmm. Sticking on the theme of PAC 2030, we'll come back, as I said, to Haiti, but I think Mr. Mitchell is helpful to contextualize, whether for our in-studio audience or for all those who are watching us on ACTV, which is what we watch at my house. How are tropical storms, rising sea levels, temperatures, other aspects of the climate, how is that impacting the growth prospects for the Bahamas, growth prospects for the wider Caribbean? You mentioned in your opening comments about climate change being an existential threat to the Bahamas. So if you could contextualize what the implications are and the concerns that how you see climate change as that existential crisis to the Bahamas. And as part of that, what are some of the solutions that you see as important?
Well, I think, first of all, the effects of climate change are so slow moving that even people in our own societies don't recognize those things when they see them. But we had Dorian in 2019, and that caused $3.25 billion worth of damage. And if you come to the country today, well, there's recovery, but there's still a lot of work to do to get back to where we were prior to Dorian. So that's one of the main impacts. But I spoke at the Explorers Club in New York during the GA, and they showed us a map. And the map says this is what the Bahamas will be like in 2070. So the Bahamas has 80% of its land is within 1 meter of the sea. Yeah. So in 2070, they showed us a map. If nothing changes, New Providence, which is the island Nassau is on, 30% of it will be underwater, and by 2100, 70% will be underwater. So that's what we face coming down the road. In the meantime, if you're going to defend yourself against climate change, you need financing to mitigate and adapt. And for example, the call for infrastructure, seawalls, fixing the roads. Because we're a limestone island, The road works as the water rises. The roads are unstable, so you are constantly having to repair roads and fix roads and seawalls and those things. So those are immediate costs. And of course, you have to keep, we've got 26 or 27 settled islands, 28 international airports. All of those things have to be maintained. Because of our GDP per capita, we can't get the concessional monies. So that's another issue. And that's an issue, of course, across the Caribbean because we're considered middle income countries.
I think it's maybe helpful to contextualize for the viewers. I mean, the statistics you put out there, what that actually means for the Bahamas, this large swath of your country that could be underwater in the near future, and what that means insofar as being able to plan ahead and kind of the broader, not just climate, but also effects on people's daily lives,
right,
as you think about the issue.
And some countries, the Pacific countries, for example, with whom we have an alliance on these matters, some of them have actually spoken to New Zealand and Australia and said, look, if we disappear, we're going to have to move to where you are. So, you're 50 miles away. You heard what I said. So when we come knocking on the door, it's a real threat. But the serious point is, of course, that the infrastructural needs are significant and the cost is significant. I think the Ministry of Works people are telling it's $1 million a mile to fix a road, and we've got 800 miles of road in the Bahamas to fix. So you're talking a huge bill.
Yeah, and Das Feinstein talking about then PAC 2030. How is the U.S. using PAC 2030 to address some of the climate concerns that the minister mentioned, both in the short term, but also with a longer term vision as well?
Yeah, so I think through PAC 2030, we're looking to leverage all the various tools within our disposal across the U.S. government, and of course, critically with the private sector as well. We recognize that there are important investments that we can make and are making through our foreign assistance, but also by serving a catalytic role with partners among the multilateral development banks and adjusting the kind of infrastructure for climate finance. We can make great advances in that regard as well and help countries like the Bahamas and others that have found themselves, especially post-pandemic, with very little space in their budget to make the kind of investments that are needed to promote adaptation and mitigation measures. If we can help on that end, then that will go a very long way. In addition, helping to de-risk investments or helping to provide some of the analysis necessary to encourage investment in renewable energy. So we are working across the U.S. government to take those kinds of measures to help in this space.
And may I add also
Please.
that one of the things I think is important, you talked about the meeting that's going to take place at CARICOM next week, is that since in the 3 stints that I've been foreign minister, I've always said that because as a fact of geography, CARICOM, the Caribbean region, the 40 million of us are tied at the hip to the United States, economically, trade-wise, all of the things you want to mention. It is necessary for there to be a continuing conversation between this country and the CARICOM region because there has to be a complete understanding between the sides about what the issues are and how policies impact what happens in CARICOM. And so that's why I think this forum is important. I think what happens with the conversations with CARICOM, the PAC 2030, all of those are good fora for us to continue this conversation because out of the conversation comes policies which I think are to the benefit of our societies.
And maybe to that point, the PAC 2030 is a slightly different model from how we've developed policy in the past, right? This is a model where the U.S. is consistently dialoguing with our Caribbean partners to formulate the plan and also, and Das Feinstein, if you want to elaborate on this, and also tweak the plan based on the input that you're receiving from Caribbean partners.
Yeah, so that process really started coming out of the Summit of the Americas, where the heads of government from CARICOM called for the establishment of these high-level action committees. And that was on energy security, on finance, and food security. And through that process, we designated senior officials from the U.S., senior officials from the Caribbean, and had technical meetings and high-level meetings to establish work plans for each of those areas. That has since transitioned into PAC 2030, but we've maintained that process of high-level leadership from both sides so that we can have an action plan that we've shared with Caribbean countries and said, this is what we intend to achieve together, and again, to hold ourselves accountable. So that we are, and there may be some areas where we can't be responsive and we need to be honest and transparent about that and then look for other solutions. Maybe it's the private sector, maybe it's the MDBs. But by having that kind of dialogue, we can hold one another accountable and make sure that we're really addressing the pain points for the Caribbean.
And and it goes specifically back to, Minister, your comments on policy continuity, right? And we've been pleased to be a partner on PAC 2030 and to launch our PAC 2030 working group last year and continue to help to inform those discussions as they move forward. Minister, you talked about climate financing and financing the development and resilience goals that are needed across the Caribbean. Can you describe the types of capital, the types of financing, whether the Bahamas and also your broader Caribbean needs to accelerate development and resilience goals?
Well, I talked about the expense. I just talked about the cost of roads. In our case, seawalls, very important. Airports need to be built or reconstructed. But my feeling is that even though government can drive a lot of this, it seems to me that the U.S. private sector can also help with a lot of this. I don't think the government can do it all on its own. So the question is, what do you invest in? I was talking with our ambassador before this program about what suggestions can be made. Of course, the tourism sector throughout the region is an important sector to invest in, and this is whether Bahamas in the north or Bermuda in the north, down to St. Lucia or Jamaica or Trinidad. This is an important sector. There's also, it seems to me, an important investment has to be made ultimately in the people of our countries. So one of the points our prime ministers made when they had the meeting with then Vice President Joe Biden in Trinidad was this question of what they called the brain drain, which is there's a situation, for example, a doctor in the Bahamas comes back, she's a specialist in anesthesiology, and she's offered a salary of $28,000 a year to work at our hospital, but she gets a job offer in the U.S. for $400,000. I mean, what do you do? I mean, what does she do? I mean, she's got an education, she's got to use it. And the then vice president said, well, you know, America wants the best, and so if the best comes along, we get the best. But it is the taxpayers of the Caribbean who are actually subsidizing the well-being of American society by our people being educated as a result of University of the West Indies is entirely subsidized by taxpayers of the Caribbean, and people migrate to the United States. And of course, the value of that education that gets translated to the United States. So our view is that is there some way that there can be a compensating investment in the education of CARICOM nationals and access to U.S. educational institutions? So that's an important investment. And then the infrastructure. I think the U.S. has been very helpful through IDB to provide, at the moment, that's the only place where we can get development assistance. And this has caused some, this question of searching around for capital. We, for example, needed $300 million to build a new hospital. And we shopped around in the U.S., couldn't find an opportunity here. But there's an opportunity in China. But then that causes friction within the U.S. political scene. You know, why are you getting money from China? But you have to get capital from where you can get it because you need development. Yeah. That's the issue there.
And how can the private sector get more involved? I mean, this challenge of sometimes the importance of the private sector, but also the need for the private sector to further step up. What would be from a public-private partnerships? Are there other ways in which you see the private sector getting more involved in some of these development needs in the Bahamas? And you mentioned the very real example of the role that China can play in being very quick to mobilize capital.
Right. So my thinking is we have a number of RFPs now that are out, for example, for developing the airports. And Grand Bahama in particular was flattened entirely by Dorian. And we're still trying to get that up off the ground. So that's an immediate kind of opportunity for, particularly since Grand Bahama is just 48 miles away, nautical miles away from the United States. So it would be a natural, it seems to me, for the private sector to look to some opportunity like that. And also hotels in Grand Bahama.
Das Feinstein, the minister mentioned the importance of institutions like the Inter-American Development Bank. What are some changes that we could expect, or what would be some optimal changes from development banks like the IDB or like the World Bank to support the Caribbean's financing needs?
Yeah, so I fully agree that much more needs to be done to expand access to finance and make our multilateral development banks more agile, more nimble, and more responsive to the needs of Caribbean countries and others that face this threat of climate change and increased vulnerability, and are also caught in this challenging situation where they're considered, based on their GDP per capita, to be higher income nations and therefore not able to borrow at competitive rates. So this is something we focus quite a bit on, especially our Treasury Department colleagues. So leading into the Summit of the Americas, actually, there was a letter sent by Secretary Blinken and Secretary Yellen to Caribbean heads of government that made some commitments that we would focus on. And that included working to make disaster clauses, debt deferment clauses available through multilateral lending. We committed to working to increase the private sector window at the Inter-American Development Bank, and as well as to increase lending through the IMF Resilience Trust and a number of other factors. So I'm pleased to say that between then and now, we've made quite a bit of progress. As you may know, maybe days into his tenure at the World Bank, Ajay Banga actually appeared virtually at the CARICOM meeting with Vice President Harris. It was something that she leaned on him to make one of his first engagements so that he could become intimately acquainted with the challenges that the Caribbean faces. So there's much more that can and will be done through upcoming COP conversations, but I think we've actually achieved quite a lot.
And also very, I think, great to see the display of partnership between the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank on addressing key regional issues, and with the Caribbean being one of the 3 pillars of the joint agreement that was signed a few months ago. Barbara, I'd also like your take. The minister mentioned the private sector. So how can the private sector also, from your perspective, be further involved in some of the development financing needs that the Bahamas faces?
Yeah, in fact, we have a recent example on the trip that I think actually was 1 year ago, around this time when the Bahamas was in seat as chair of CARICOM, and our special envoy for climate change, John Kerry, as well as the head of EXIM Bank, Rita Jo Lewis, Special Presidential Advisor Dodd, and Assistant Secretary Brian Nichols all led a delegation to that CARICOM heads of government meeting. That was an opportunity for the head of EXIM to go out and look at different development opportunities in the Bahamas, to talk to the private sector, and out of that emerged 2 very significant projects. One of them to help rehabilitate an energy facility that was devastated by Dorian. That's the largest EXIM project in the Caribbean right now. And another was working with the private sector and, of course, the Bahamas government on a tender that will bring online 100 megawatts of electricity. So I think it's those kinds of initiatives of working sort of blended finance, working with the private sector, working with governments, because we recognize that governments alone are not going to be able to solve this problem. I think de-risking, again, is an important part of the equation.
Excellent points. Keeping my eye on the time, I want to make sure that we shift the conversation to an incredibly important topic, which is Haiti. Mr. Mitch, I'll begin with you. If you could share with the audience your take on the situation currently in Haiti, and also why Haiti is so important to your country, and finding a pathway forward is of critical importance to the well-being of the Bahamas.
Okay, so Haiti sits 90 miles to the south of our most southern island, which is Inagua. And it is a source of migration to the Bahamas, largely for labor, but also illegal migration, or irregular migration, as it's now called. And it has budget implications. It has caused fracture lines in our politics. So it's very finely based, the policies you have to apply. We have been involved since 2002, my first time on this job, in many of the political issues in Haiti, trying to resolve those problems. And I described them to my colleagues who joined laterally with this as intractable, just difficult to build a consensus in that society. One of which is because the society was the first black republic in the hemisphere, in the world. There's a feeling that you cannot dictate terms to them because they've done it all before. Yeah. And we appreciate the role which they played, the historic role which they played in the development of democracy in this region. Having said that, the instability is a problem for all countries around. And so we have to invest in trying to see if we can help them resolve the problem. And so far, it's been elusive. We support the multinational policing action, which was approved by the United Nations. We support the efforts by the United States, Canada, and other developed countries to put resources behind trying to get that done. We deeply appreciate what the Kenyans are doing and other African countries. But at the end of the day, you can have security, you can put in troops or police officers, but you need a political solution. And that still eludes us at this point.
A quick follow-up question there. You described the situation as intractable and the solution is elusive. What would optimally be the road ahead in the short to medium term?
My thinking is that notwithstanding the disagreements and the attempt to reach a consensus, I think that you have a sufficient majority that wants to go in a particular direction. I think the international community should stand firmly behind that, set a date and move toward that date and have the elections. And then that government will have the legitimacy, in my view, to carry matters forward.
Das Feinstein, how would you describe the current U.S. role and perspectives on Haiti?
So like Foreign Minister Mitchell, I think we remain deeply concerned about the situation in Haiti, the humanitarian crisis there, the killings, the kidnappings, the sexual assault, the rape. When you think that the country cannot plunge any deeper, then you continue to see devastation by the day. So like Foreign Minister Mitchell, we have a strong belief that there must be greater political consensus and the country needs to be restored in terms of democratic order there. The fact that you don't have a single elected official at any level of government is hugely problematic. And we also believe that elections that are credible, that are inclusive, and that are taking place within a secure environment is the best way to move forward. On the security front, we have provided a significant, sizable sum of money to support the Haitian National Police, to strengthen that as the country's premier or primary source of security for the population. And like many Haitians, also believe that in order to provide security at this point in time, when the HNP, the Haitian National Police, is simply outmatched, outgunned by gang violence. Port-au-Prince today, about 80% of that is overrun by gangs, that you do need some sort of outside, in this case, multinational security support mission to come in. We were pleased that in October, the United Nations did endorse the deployment of such a mission. We've been very grateful to Kenya for their leadership. And on the United States' part, we have pledged to work with our Congress to provide $200 million, of which that would include support from the Department of Defense, from the State Department as well, to help deploy this force. Earlier this week, there was a planning conference in Washington where we had important stakeholders involved in the mission sort of flesh out further the concept of operations and most critically talk about the oversight and accountability measures. One thing that was very key in the Security Council resolution that we pushed hard for, with strong support from many other partners, was the need to learn lessons from prior missions in Haiti, particularly with regard to human rights, oversight and accountability, prevention of sexual assault and violence. And so there was a very important discussion in that meeting about how those mechanisms can be built into the mission.
And importantly, as you mentioned, Das Feinstein, working with the partners. If you could elaborate a little bit more on how the U.S. is working with a number of partners in carving out this strategy moving forward.
So I think it's been reported in the news there will be an important high-level meeting next week, which will offer an opportunity on the margins of the G20 in Rio de Janeiro for international partners to step up and discuss how they will pledge and commit to the mission in Haiti. We're very grateful for the contributions and announcements that the Bahamas has already made. Jamaica also has made very important contributions and announcements, other partners in the Caribbean and worldwide. So, under Kenya's leadership, as they go through their own domestic process, we will look to them to determine how best to allocate those resources.
Thank you so much. Foreign Minister, would you like to respond to some of the points that Das Feinstein made on some of the actions being taken at international level?
Well, we support everything that she said, and it is not difficult. It is not an easy thing for us because it's not a popular action in our own country. But we've tried to make the case that we have no choice in this matter but to be at the table and to support trying to resolve the problem. We have committed. Our former Prime Minister, Perry Christie, is sitting with the former Prime Minister of St. Lucia, Kenny Anthony, and former Prime Minister of Jamaica, Bruce Golding, as an eminent persons group. And they've been working with the politicians in Haiti trying to forge a consensus because ultimately, as I say, the solution is a political one. And the society has to come to an agreement that this is what we're going to do. It's really unfortunate that the country seems to divide in such a way that you can't strike a consensus. So my thinking is now that you just have to get a majority and have people coalesce around a set of objectives, and let's set those objectives and go at them and see and make the best of it. I think that's where we are now.
Yeah. I think one thing that's been clear to me over the course of this conversation is how strong U.S.-Bahamian relations are and the partnership that exists between our two countries, and how that partnership has only grown over the course of the last few years and will continue to grow with the leadership of people like both of you here at the table and our broader governments. This is a holiday weekend. As I mentioned previously, there's a snowstorm coming in tonight. And so we want to end on time, but I want to end by also thanking two of my colleagues, Charlie and Maite, who did excellent work alongside the Bahamian Embassy for helping to coordinate this event. I'll also say it's great to have you here, Foreign Minister, in Washington, but I think it's always better in the Bahamas.
Yes, it is. I want to say that again. It is better in the Bahamas. Don't mind the headlines in the newspapers.
So appreciate you being here, and Das Feinstein, very much appreciate you taking the time on a Friday afternoon to be here, and look forward to continuing this conversation here or continuing this conversation in the Bahamas. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to the future of our work together.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.